The Omega. Spent 3 years leaving food at a wounded wolf's den. Then he walked out upright. Her grandmother had said it first, standing over a broken-winged crow in the yard, pressing seeds into Marin's small palm. Whatever you tend in secret, the world will reckon with in the open. Marin Ashvail had been 7. She hadn't understood. She'd fed the crow anyway, because it was there, and it was hungry, and she had enough to share. The crow had flown away one morning, without ceremony, without looking back, and Marin had stood in the yard and felt something she couldn't name. Not loss, exactly. More like completion. She was 23 now, and still feeding things that couldn't ask for help, in a valley at the far edge of the Duskfall Pack's territory, where the pine trees grew so thick they ate the light. She hadn't thought about her grandmother's saying in years. She was about to think about it for the rest of her life. Chapter 1. The Den in the Hollow. The Duskfall Pack did not think much of Marin Ashvail. This was not unusual for Omegas in the territory. They were tolerated, assigned the mending and the cooking and the carrying, never invited to the fires where decisions were made. But Marin's case was particular, because Marin had no wolf. Not suppressed, not late emerging, simply absent, the way a note can be missing from a chord, and the chord still played, but wrong. The pack healer, old Cressa, had tested her at 16, and again at 18, and shaken her head both times. "There's something there," Cressa had said once, half to herself, "but it's waiting." No one else in the pack found that interesting. They found it pathetic. So Marin lived at the pack's margin in every sense. Her cottage was a 20-minute walk from the nearest cluster of homes, set at the edge of the forest, where the territory thinned toward the uncharted ridge. She paid her pack tithe in preserved food, because she was an exceptional forager and a careful cook, and the Alpha, a broad, indifferent man named Dovrik, accepted her jars of berry preserves and smoked fish and dried herbs without comment. That was the extent of their relationship. She had found the den in early spring, 3 years ago, entirely by accident. She'd been tracking the run of trout in the shallow creek that cut through the hollow beneath the ridge, and she'd smelled blood, thick and old and layered, the way a wound smells when it has been tending itself for weeks. She'd followed it to a gap between 2 boulders, screened by a curtain of hanging moss, and she'd stopped 3 feet away because the growl that came from inside it was the lowest, most bone-dissolving sound she had ever heard. Not a pack wolf. The scent was wrong, sharper, wilder, carrying the mineral cold of mountains she had never visited. Whatever was inside that den was enormous, and injured, and alone. Marin had stood very still. Then she'd set down the smoked rabbit she'd wrapped in cloth for her own supper, placed it on the flat rock nearest the den mouth, and walked home. She hadn't known why, exactly. The crow, maybe. Her grandmother's voice. The simple fact that she had enough and whatever was in that hollow did not. She'd gone back the next morning. The rabbit was gone. The flat rock was clean. She'd gone back every day since. Chapter 2. 3 years of learning to listen. The first year Marin left food and received nothing. No sound, no acknowledgement. Just the reliable fact of an empty rock each morning. She learned the rhythm of the hollow. She learned which approach path carried her scent away from the den mouth on the prevailing wind. Because on the days she misjudged the breeze, the growl came, low and warning, and she would stop and wait until the tension eased. She never came closer than the flat rock. She had decided, without consciously deciding it, that proximity was his to grant. She thought of the wolf inside as him from the first winter, when she'd heard once a sound that wasn't a growl. It was more like an exhalation. Long, rough-edged, exhausted. And it had struck her as profoundly, specifically, male. She did not know what that meant about her instincts, and she did not interrogate it. The second year, the growl stopped. Instead, when she left food, she would sometimes hear a slow shift of weight in the dark behind the moss curtain, a deliberate settling, like an acknowledgement. She began to talk, because the silence felt less like emptiness and more like attention. She talked about small things. The trout run, the particular fury of the pack's beta female, Sorsha, who had publicly called Marin the wolfless charity case during the autumn tithe. The way the light fell through the pines in the hour before dusk, amber-streaked and cathedral-still. She talked without expectation of reply. It felt, in those minutes by the mossy boulders, more like honest conversation than anything she had in the pack. In the 3rd year, the wolf began to leave things on the flat rock. The first was a pine cone, which meant nothing, probably. But then a smooth river stone with a vein of white quartz running through it. Then a knot of dried wildflowers, clumsy and crushed, clearly not arranged so much as collected and deposited. Marin kept each one. She kept them in a clay bowl on her windowsill, and at night she turned the quartz-streaked stone in her fingers and thought about hands that might have placed it there, and felt a warmth in her chest she had no name for yet. She had a name for it by the 3rd autumn, but she was afraid of the name, so she didn't use it. Chapter 3. The world shifts. The crisis came from outside, the way most crises do, not from the thing you have been quietly tending, but from the world that refused to stay at a polite distance. Alpha Dovrik announced at the autumn gathering that a formal alliance was being pursued with the Iron Gate pack from the northern valleys. This was presented as good news. Iron Gate was large, powerful, wealthy in land and in numbers. The terms of the alliance included a traditional ceremony of pack ranking, in which Iron Gate's Alpha King, who was, Sorsha breathlessly reported, unmated, and of exceptional standing, would visit Duskfall and assess their pack's strength. "He'll be evaluating everyone," Sorsha said, in the way she said most things, loudly and in Marin's direction, so that the pointed exclusion would be witnessed. "Wolves of worth. Pack wolves." The implication was clear enough. Marin was not worth evaluating. Marin did not officially exist in the ledger of the pack's valuable things. What the announcement meant to Marin, more practically, was disruption. Dovrik began sending pack members out to patrol and clean up the territory's edges, to present the pack's borders as tidy and well-maintained. When one of those patrol groups stumbled into the hollow near the ridge, following a stream survey, Marin heard about it secondhand from old Cressa, who mentioned it without knowing its significance. "Strange thing," Cressa said, grinding dried yarrow. "Young Brath says there's a den out past the second ridge hollow. Old one, maybe. Smells like wolf, but foreign." Marin's hands went still over the bundle of time she was sorting. "Did they go in?" "Brath said he got 3 steps from the entrance and something inside made a sound that convinced him to be elsewhere." Cressa smiled thinly. "He's been jumping at shadows since." Marin exhaled. Not investigated. Not reported to Dovrik, apparently. Brath being the sort who preferred to forget encounters that frightened him. But Dovrik was preparing the territory for a visiting Alpha King, who would have exquisitely sensitive instincts and extraordinary range of scent detection. She had to warn the wolf in the hollow. She did not know how. She had never been answered in words. She went the next morning before dawn, moving fast through the dark pine corridor, and she crouched by the flat rock and said it plainly. "There are going to be wolves all over this territory in 2 weeks. Important wolves, not local. If you're here, they'll find you, and I don't know what Dovrik will do about a strange wolf sheltering in his claimed land." The hollow was so quiet she could hear the creak. Then, from behind the moss curtain, came a sound she had never heard before from that den. Not a growl, not a settling weight. A single word, rough and disused as an old gate swinging open. "Noted." Marin sat down on the cold ground because her legs stopped working. Chapter 4. He walks out upright. He came out 3 days before the Iron Gate delegation arrived. Marin had come at her usual time, just past dawn, with a cloth-wrapped packet of venison and herb flatbread. She set it on the rock. She straightened. She was turning to go when the moss curtain moved, not with wind, with intent, and pushed aside. She had imagined this. In 2.5 years of leaving food and collecting stones, she had imagined many versions of this moment. A wolf, enormous and ragged, crawling out on injured limbs. A man, thin and pale, half-conscious and barely coherent. She was not prepared for what actually emerged. He walked out upright. He was tall, taller than any man in Duskfall Pack, broad through the shoulders in a way that the worn, inadequate shirt he wore could not conceal, though it tried valiantly. His hair was dark and overgrown, touching his jaw. He had a beard that had gone well past intention into territory. His left arm bore a scar that ran from wrist to elbow in a thick, deliberate line, old now, silvered, but once it had been the kind of wound that explained weeks of that iron blood smell. He moved with a careful deliberateness, weight distributed as though he had only recently relearned to trust his own body, and there was something in his gait that made it clear. This was not a man who had always walked carefully. This was a man who had walked fast and certain and commanding, and was returning to that, step by step. His eyes, when they found her, were the particular amber gold of pine sap in direct sun. They were devastating. He stopped 4 feet from the flat rock and looked at her with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite assessment and was entirely something she didn't have a word for. "You're smaller than I thought," he said. His voice was rough from disuse and from something else, a lifetime of authority maybe, sitting underneath the roughness like bedrock. "You're taller than I thought," Marin said, because it was true, and because she needed to say something, or she would simply stand here and vibrate until she became geologically insignificant. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Marin. Her name in his voice. 3 years of listening to her talk, and he had kept her name like the river stone, without her knowing. "I don't know your name," she said. "Calder," he said. "Calder Voss." She found out later what that name meant, in the territories to the north. She found out later that the scar on his arm had been put there by a coup within his own pack, that he had fled wounded and alone, and chosen the hollow beneath the Duskfall Ridge to bleed and heal and choose whether to live. She found out all of it later. Right now she only had the name and the amber eyes, and the extraordinary, impossible fact of him standing in morning light after 3 years of darkness. "The delegation from Irongate," she said, because she was practical and frightened, and focusing on the practical was the only way she was staying upright herself. "They arrive in 3 days. "I know." He picked up the cloth-wrapped food from the rock with his right hand, with the ease and naturalness of someone receiving a gift rather than charity. "I'll be gone from the hollow. There are things I've been waiting to attend to." "You're leaving the territory." "No." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I'm arriving in it." Chapter 5. What the Pack Sees. The Iron Gate delegation entered the Duskfall territory on a cold, bright morning, through the northern tree line, and the entire pack was assembled in the valley clearing to receive them. Marin stood at the back. This was where she always stood. The delegation was 12 wolves, large and well presented, in the heavy outer coats of northern mountain packs. They crossed the clearing with that particular fluid unity of a pack long accustomed to moving together. Behind them came their Alpha King. Marin watched Sorsha's face go through several remarkable transformations in quick succession. The Iron Gate Alpha King was Calder Voss. He was still tall. He was still broad. The worn shirt had been replaced with the coat of his rank, deep charcoal with iron clasps, and his hair was still longer than convention. But now it was intentional, and he moved the way she'd known he could move, fast and certain and commanding, every stride eating distance, every glance precise. He surveyed the assembled Duskfall pack with amber gold eyes that gave nothing away. Davrik went forward with the traditional greeting. The formalities moved around Marin like water around a stone, because she was watching Calder, and he was watching the assembled pack, and then, with the unerring accuracy of a man who had spent 3 years learning the exact sound and dimension of a single person, his eyes found her at the back of the crowd. Nothing in his expression changed. He looked away. The ceremony continued. Marin felt her heart performing operations she had not authorized. Later, much later, after the formal dinner she was not invited to, after the pack demonstration she watched from a distance, a member of the Iron Gate delegation found her at the edge of the tree line, where she'd gone to breathe. "The Alpha King requests a private meeting," the woman said without effect. "At the Ridge Hollow, tomorrow at dawn." "Did he say why?" The woman looked at her with an expression that suggested the question was charmingly naive. "He's the Alpha King." Maren went home and sat by her window and turned the quartz-streaked riverstone in her fingers for a very long time. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. She was at the Hollow before dawn, because she was always at the Hollow before dawn. Old habit, old love, if she was being honest with herself in the dark. He was already there, sitting on the flat rock, which was such an inversion of 3 years of empty stone and left offerings that she actually laughed. A short, startled sound that bounced off the boulders. He looked up. In the gray pre-light, his face was very clear, and he was not wearing his formal coat. He was wearing the worn shirt, and she understood this was intentional. "You laughed," he said. "You're on the rock." She stopped a few feet away, the distance that had been hers to Grant, now inverted. He understood this too. She could see it in the way he waited, not moving closer, holding the space open for her. "I owe you a material accounting," he said, "that I am incapable of giving. 3 years of food, and the creek trout in spring, and the fact that you talked to me when talking to me gave you nothing." "It gave me quite a lot," Maren said. "I didn't have anyone who listened." "I listened." A pause. "I kept every word." She breathed. "The delegation is here for a ranking ceremony and an alliance review. That's political." "Yes. And Dovrik will agree to whatever Iron Gate proposes because Duskfall needs the alliance." "Yes. So when you tell me that you have things to attend to in this territory..." She stopped, started again. "If you are about to tell me that you are doing this because I fed you, I will walk away right now. I fed you because you were wounded, and I had enough, and that is the only reason that matters, and I will not be a debt that someone settles." The silence after this was enormous and complete. Calder stood up from the flat rock. He moved to within 2 feet of her, and she held her ground, and the amber in his eyes in the first true light of dawn was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I know what your pack has named you. I spent 3 years in a dark hollow with a ruined arm, choosing whether to live, and the thing that made the choice feel possible was the sound of your voice, and the fact that a wolfless Omega in a pack that undervalued her came to a strange den every morning, because the world would not be diminished by kindness, and you had enough to share." Maren's throat had closed. "You are not a debt," he said. "You are the reason the debt exists, the reason any of this matters." He reached into the pocket of his worn shirt and produced something small and smooth. A river stone, white quartz vein catching the first light. Not the one he had left for her years ago. A new one. "I have been collecting these since the 2nd winter," he said, "because I had nothing else to offer and I needed to offer something. And I thought she will understand the language." She took the stone from his hand. Their fingers touched for the first time. "What are you asking?" she managed. "I'm asking if you'll come north." His voice had gone rough again, in a different way, not disuse, not authority. Something private and careful. "Not as a guest, as the one I want beside me, as my equal, my match, my mate, if you'll have me. I know what I'm asking. I know what I'm asking you to leave." "You're asking me to leave a pack that thinks I don't exist?" "Yes. That's not the hard part." She looked down at the stone in her palm, then back up at him. "The hard part is trusting that you see me, that you aren't seeing the version of me that saved you. I see the version of you that sat in the cold and talked about light through pine trees because you were lonely and generous, and the world hadn't caught up with your worth yet." His hand was still close. "I would like to be the beginning of the world catching up." She thought about her grandmother. The crow. Whatever you tend in secret, the world will reckon with in the open. She placed her hand in his. Chapter 7. The Ceremony of Worth. What Calder had called things to attend to in Duskfall territory turned out to be comprehensive. The alliance negotiation took 3 days, during which Calder's lead delegate, a precise woman named Fen, went through Duskfall's pack records with an auditor's eye and kept pausing at Marin's name in the tithe lists. "This contributor," Fen said on the 2nd day, in front of Dovrik and his council, "has been sustaining the Eastern supply stores. Without her, your winter stock calculus doesn't work." Dovrik looked uncomfortable. This was his most common expression over those 3 days. The traditional ranking ceremony, which Calder had the authority to either conduct or waive, he conducted in full. Every member of the Duskfall pack was assessed, not for raw power, not for shift-form dominance, but by the Iron Gate system, which was older and more complete. It measured contribution, steadiness, acts of care for the pack's continuance. Marin, by the Iron Gate assessment, ranked second. The moment when Calder read the results aloud was the moment she discovered what it felt like when a number, a public, formal, witnessed number, replaced 3 years of being invisible. She stood in the assembled pack and felt something shift in the ground beneath her, as though the territory itself was readjusting. Sorsha's face, on this occasion, was less entertaining and more simply human, stripped of its habitual contempt and left with something raw and embarrassed. Marin didn't look at it long. She wasn't interested in contempt, hers or anyone else's. Cressa found her afterward. The old healer put both her weathered hands around Marin's face and studied her with dark, clever eyes. "I said there was something waiting," Cressa said. "I was right about the waiting part." "You were right about all of it," Marin told her. "Thank you." She meant it. Cressa had been the only person in the pack who had ever used the word something about her, rather than nothing. On the 3rd evening, with the alliance formally signed and the Iron Gate delegation preparing to leave, Calder stood beside Marin in the valley clearing and addressed both packs together. He spoke about the alliance in the formal language expected of him. Then he paused, and what came next was not formal at all. "I also want to name, for the record of both packs, who in this territory kept me alive when I had no reason to live, and no pack at my back." He said it simply, without performance. "She knows who she is. The rest of you should know it too." Marin looked at the ground and felt the warmth in her chest she had finally named, blazing now like a forge. Chapter 8. Departure and the stone in her pocket. She packed lightly. 3 years of foraging and preserving had taught her what mattered. Tools, knowledge, a few personal items. She left the cottage to Cressa, who had always secretly coveted the eastern light through its windows. The day before departure, she walked every path she knew in the Duskfall forest, not in grief, not in resentment, but in a kind of final inventory. The hollow beneath the ridge she visited last. The den mouth was just boulders and moss. The flat offering rock was ordinary stone, without the smell of blood and survival behind the curtain of moss. The hollow was simply a hollow, pretty in its pine-shadowed way, tucked beneath the ridge. She stood there a long time. She thought about who she had been when she first found it. 20 on her own, feeding herself and paying her tithe, and having conversations with a healer, and otherwise living in a state of profound, functional solitude. She had not been unhappy exactly. She had been incomplete in the way of the chord with the missing note, functional but haunted by what it could have been. She thought about what Calder had said. "I would like to be the beginning of the world catching up." She picked up the small river stone from the flat rock, the original one, the first gift with the white quartz vein, and slipped it into her pocket. She had left it there last week while sorting her windowsill bowl of collected gifts. An instinct. Keep this one here, at the origin of it. She retrieved it now because she understood. You don't leave your origins behind. You carry them into what you become. The Iron Gate delegation left at noon with the road north spreading before them, wide and pale in autumn sun. Calder rode at the head. He reached back without looking, and Marin brought her horse alongside his, and he took her hand over the gap between them the way he had taken it at the hollow in the dawn, careful, certain, grateful beyond measure. She kept the stone in her coat pocket, smooth against her fingers, for the entire 3-day ride north. Epilogue. 1 year later. The northern valley that housed Iron Gate Pack's territory had the kind of scale that took your breath for the first few months, and then became simply home. Mountains that turned rose and silver at dawn, pine forests that went up instead of sideways, air that tasted of snow even in summer. Maren Voss, she had taken the name, had chosen it. It felt like putting on something made exactly for her shape, stood in the great hall on a bright October morning, and received the pack's autumn welfare report from her deputy, a stocky young Omega named Rue, who had appointed herself Marn's personal champion within approximately a week of Marn's arrival, and had never rescinded the appointment. Eastern stores up 14% from last year, Rue reported, with the satisfaction of someone announcing personal victories. And the elder cottages are fully winterized. That was the preservation smoking technique you brought from the south. They're calling it the Ashval method. Maren looked up from the ledger. They don't need to call it anything. They want to. Rue had the tone of someone who had already decided. Let them. After the report, Maren walked to the window where the October light came through at a low angle, amber-streaked and cathedral still, exactly as it had in the Duskfall forest, because some light was apparently loyal enough to follow you north. She heard Calder before she felt him, his step in the hall, the particular unhurried certainty of it, and then his hands at her shoulders, his chin at her hair. Rue informs me, he said, that you tried to prevent them naming the smoking technique after you. It's a practical technique. It shouldn't need a name. Everything you do, he said with calm precision, should have your name on it. I am prepared to be unreasonable about this. She laughed. She reached into the pocket of her coat. She wore it inside sometimes, in the cold halls, a habit she couldn't be bothered to apologize for. And her fingers found the river stone. Smooth, white quartz vein warmed by her body. She turned to face him and held it up between them. He looked at the stone, and she watched something move through his amber eyes. Recognition, history, the particular weight of 3 years of dark and hunger, and an unknown woman leaving food on a rock because she had enough to share, and the world would not be diminished by kindness. Whatever you tend in secret, she said, her grandmother's voice after all this time, finally arriving at its destination. The world will reckon with in the open. Calder took the stone from her hand. He turned it once, the quartz catching the October light. Then he placed it back in her palm and closed her fingers around it. The world reckoned, he said quietly. It's still reckoning. She leaned up and kissed him, with the stone warm between their joined hands and the northern light pouring through the window, and felt the chord. Full now, every note present and sounding, resolve at last into music. Endi siusin da kios,